You ever hear barbed wire sing? Not in some pretty cowboy ballad way. I mean that thin metallic whine it makes when the wind hits it just right, like the land is warning you to keep your hands to yourself. That night, it wasn't the wind making the sound. It was a man crawling through Jake Caldwell's new fence with a pair of cutters, moving slow, trying to disappear into the dark like guilt. I lifted my lantern, and the light spilled across the wire in a warm, trembling circle. And there he was, half-crouched, coat snagged on a barb, face turned up toward us with the kind of fear that makes you look younger than you are. Jake stood maybe 10 feet away, close enough to end it, far enough that he didn't have to smell the boy's breath. He held his rifle the way a man holds a decision he doesn't want to make, not shaking, not showing off, just steady, cold even. Now, you and me, we're sitting here like it's just another story at the fire. But in the Texas Panhandle, in the middle of the 1880s, barbed wire could start a war faster than whiskey ever did. Folks back east thought it was progress. Out here, it was a line in the dirt that said mine and dared somebody to argue. Jake didn't shout, didn't rush. He spoke like a judge who's already heard every excuse. Drop the cutters. The kid froze. The lantern light caught his cheekbones, his cracked lips, the raw windburn on his skin. He wasn't dressed like an outlaw. No fancy gun belt, no gambler's coat. He looked like a homesteader's son. Patched wool, work shirt, hands scraped up from honest labor and bad luck. He swallowed and tried to find his voice. Your fence blocks the creek. Jake's jaw barely moved when he answered. My fence keeps my cattle alive. The kid's eyes flashed. He lifted his chin like pride was the only thing holding him upright. My sisters are alive, too. Now think about that for a second. 2 truths, both sharp, both heavy, and a rifle sitting right between them like a final word. Margaret Sullivan stepped up beside my lantern glow, close enough that I could see the set of her mouth. She wasn't shaken, and that mattered. A lot of people think bravery looks like charging forward. Sometimes it's just holding your ground when your body is begging you to step back. Jake, she said, low and steady, don't. Jake didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the boy like he was doing math in his head. What it cost to show mercy, what it cost to be cruel, what it cost to let this keep happening. He spoke again. Last warning. The kid's fingers loosened. The cutter slipped and hit the dirt with a soft clink. He raised his hands, palms out. That wasn't repentance. That was survival taking the wheel. Jake held the rifle on him for another long breath, then lowered it. Just a little. Not enough to forgive. Just enough to say, I'm choosing not to kill you right now. Go, Jake said. The kid didn't move at first, like he couldn't believe mercy was real, like he expected the next second to be the one where somebody decided to prove a point. Margaret took 1 step forward, lantern light brightening her face. Go home. That did it. The kid backed away too fast, coat catching on a barb. He cursed under his breath, more from panic than anger, and tore free. Then he ran, stumbled once, kept running, a dark shape swallowed by darker prairie. Jake watched him vanish and still didn't relax. Men like Jake don't relax. They just decide where to put their tension so it doesn't spill onto the wrong person. Margaret exhaled and the lantern dipped slightly, just a fraction, like the weight of what almost happened finally hit her shoulders. Jake finally turned toward her. You didn't have to come out here. Margaret didn't flinch. I live here. That makes it my business. He stared at her for a moment, and I could see something shift behind his eyes. Not warmth, not gratitude, something more complicated, like he didn't like being reminded that other people's choices could drag him back toward being human. Then he said, tomorrow I ride to his father. Margaret didn't ask what that meant. She knew. Out here a talk could turn into a feud if pride got loose and started running. Her voice stayed calm anyway. To threaten him. Jake looked past her, out into the dark where the boy had disappeared. To talk, he said, and then after a pause that tasted like iron. And if talking fails? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I'm the host of Savage West Stories, and I'm telling you, sometimes the truest parts of a man are the things he refuses to say out loud, especially when there's a rifle involved. The wind shifted, the wire gave one last phenom, and for a second the whole prairie felt like it was listening. Margaret tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Jake slung the rifle lower, pointed at the dirt now, but still there, still part of him. You think the danger ended when the boy ran? That's what people want from stories, a clean release, a clear ending. But the frontier doesn't do clean endings. It does consequences. Because that boy wasn't a hardened wrestler. He wasn't some storybook villain. He was hungry.
was scared, and he believed, right or wrong, that Jake's fence was stealing water from his family. And Jake Caldwell, he wasn't a lawman, he wasn't a saint. He was a rancher trying to keep a spread alive in a time when the open range was shrinking, and every new line of wire was another reason for someone to come in the night with cutters and a grudge. That's the thing people forget. They talk about the West like it was lawless. Truth is, it was full of laws. Some were written in county books, some were written on paper deeds, and some were written in the way men looked at each other across a fence line at midnight, deciding how far they'd go to protect what they believed was theirs. Margaret stood there in the lantern light, looking at Jake like she was trying to figure out what kind of man he really was, and Jake stood there looking out into the dark like he was trying to figure out what kind of man he was becoming. Finally, Margaret lifted the lantern and turned back toward the ranch buildings. The small warm dots of light in the windows looked fragile out there, like something you could snuff with one careless choice. Jake followed, boots quiet in the dust, and as they walked I remembered thinking, this isn't just about wire. It's never just about wire. It's about what people do when survival starts to feel like permission. Back at the cookhouse, Margaret set the lantern on the table. The flame steadied it, the room filled with that soft, familiar glow. Wood, iron stove, tin dishes, the smell of smoke that never really leaves your clothes. Jake paused in the doorway, half in shadow. He looked back once, toward the fence line, like he expected the night to speak again. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't offer comfort, and she didn't accuse him either. Out here you learn fast that words can be sparks. Jake finally stepped inside and let the door close behind him. Tomorrow was coming, and tomorrow meant daylight, conversations, witnesses, the kind of decisions that don't hide as easily as a boy running into the dark. So if you're still with me by this fire, hold on to that image, barbed wire humming, a lantern shaking just a little, a rifle lowering by inches. Because the next part of this story isn't about who's right. It's about what happens after a man chooses restraint once, and has to live with the fact that he might not get the chance to choose it again.
I'm the host over at Savage West Stories, and if you're still here with me by this fire, then you already know something the frontier teaches quick. People don't come west for the reasons they put on the outside. They come west because something back home stopped working. Margaret Sullivan didn't come chasing romance. She didn't come hunting adventure either. She came because the numbers quit adding up. Back east, in a city like Philadelphia, you could be surrounded by brick and gaslight and polished manners and still end up drowning, quietly, respectably, with nobody noticing until you were gone. And after the panic of 1873, a lot of folks learned that lesson the hard way. Banks failed, jobs disappeared, and security turned out to be a word people used when they wanted to sleep at night. Margaret was a widow by then. Not the kind in stories where grief makes you delicate and poetic, the kind who wakes up one morning and realizes her life has been sold out underneath her, piece by piece, and nobody asked her permission. Her husband died, and what he left behind wasn't just absence, it was paper, bills, notes, debts that sat on the table like ugly guests who wouldn't take a hint. You ever see a person read a stack of bills like it's a death sentence? That's what it looked like. She could have gone to family, most people did, but family help always has teeth. It comes with lectures, it comes with conditions, it comes with the kind of pity that turns into control the moment you accept it. And Margaret, she wasn't built to be owned by anyone's charity. So she did the one thing America still let you do when you were broke and desperate and stubborn. She moved. She sold what she could, she packed what she couldn't bear to lose, 2 trunks maybe, a couple worn carpet bags, the kind of luggage that tells the truth. You're not traveling for leisure, you're escaping. And then she found the advertisement. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't even kind, just a few blunt lines in a small paper, the sort of notice that smelled like ink and dust and somebody's last option. Cook and housekeeper wanted, remote ranch, wages, room, board, literacy preferred. Literacy preferred. That line mattered, because it meant whoever posted it needed more than a woman who could stir a pot. They needed someone who could read instructions, keep accounts, write a letter if it came to that. They needed competence. Margaret folded that paper until the creases went white. She carried it like a passport. Her trip west wasn't a montage. It was long, uncomfortable, and full of moments where she wondered if she'd lost her mind. Train cars that smelled of coal smoke and stale wool. Waiting rooms where the lamps burned low and people slept sitting up. Towns that got smaller and meaner the farther she went, like the world was shedding its softness on purpose. And then she arrived in the Texas Panhandle. Not a grand station, not a welcoming committee, just a dusty stop that barely deserved the name town. A few rough wooden buildings pressed together like they were trying not to be blown away. A hitching rail crowded with tired horses. A general store with barrels out front. a saloon that promised warmth and delivered trouble. The wind out there doesn't ask your permission. It just takes what it wants. It puts grit in your teeth. It dries your eyes until you blink like you're learning how all over again. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still use tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still use tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still use tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still use tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still use tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still used tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure distance with. No trees, no fences for long stretches, just prairie grass rolling like an ocean, and a sky so big it felt like it could press you flat if it decided to. Margaret stepped down with her bags and felt every stare land on her. A white woman alone, dressed like she came from somewhere people still used tablecloths. Out there, that made her noticeable in the worst way. She asked about the job, she got directions, and then she was told the ranch owner wasn't coming to fetch her. He was sending a wagon. Now think about that for a second. A man who won't come himself might not care, or he might care too much and doesn't want you to see it. Either way, you learn something. You're not stepping into a polite arrangement. You're stepping into somebody's controlled world. The freight wagon took her the rest of the way, 30 miles or give or take. The land opened up until there was almost nothing to measure.
Out on the Panhandle, you don't learn slowly. The land doesn't allow it, and hungry men sure don't either. When Margaret Sullivan first stepped into Jake Caldwell's cookhouse, she thought she was signing up to feed a ranch crew. What she actually signed up for was a daily wrestling match with heat, time, and exhaustion, and none of those things care where you came from. Before sunrise, the cookhouse was a different kind of dark. Not city dark, not the soft sort that comes with street lamps and curtains. This was raw, open dark, pressed up against a small room made of rough boards and stubbornness. Margaret would strike a match and watch the flame jump like it was startled to be alive. Then she'd lean into that cast iron stove and try to coax it awake. A wood stove isn't like the stoves back east. It has moods. It runs hot when you least want it to, and sulks when you need it most. Margaret learned fast that fire is a living thing out here. You don't turn it on, you negotiate with it. She learned bread the hard way too. Not the gentle, measured baking you do when ingredients are cheap and time is polite. This was frontier bread. Sourdough starter kept in a jar like a pet you have to feed. Because if it dies, you don't just miss dessert, you miss calories. And on a ranch, calories are currency. Coffee was the same. Out here, coffee wasn't a beverage, it was a tool. It was warmth, courage, and a kind of truth before dawn. She ground it by hand until her forearms burned, because nobody cares how refined your upbringing was when 15 men want their cups filled and their tempers managed. And the rest of the work didn't wait politely in the corner. Laundry meant boiling shirts in lye water that bit at your skin. It meant wringing fabrics so heavy it felt like it wanted to pull your arms out of their sockets. It meant hanging clothes on a line while the wind snapped them like flags, dust blowing up into your eyes and settling everywhere like a second layer of life you didn't ask for. Margaret's hands changed first. The soft city skin didn't last. Knuckles reddened, fingers nicked. A blister would form, break, and form again in the exact same spot, like the ranch was leaving its signature on her. The men watched her during those early days, not always openly, but she felt it. Cowboys don't usually mean harm by it, they're just taking a measure. A woman alone on a ranch is unusual. A woman from back east with a proper posture and an educated voice is more unusual than a snowstorm in August. Jake handled that problem the way he handled most problems. He drew a line and expected everyone to respect it. The first morning the whole crew sat down for breakfast. He stood at the doorway, hat low, eyes steady, and he spoke in that calm way of his that didn't invite argument. He made it clear she wasn't entertainment. He made it clear she wasn't prey. He made it clear she'd eat after the men, not because she was lesser, but because that was how you kept a rough situation from becoming ugly. Some of the cowboys didn't like being told. You could see it in the way a jaw tightened, the way a chair scratched back a little harder than it needed to. But Jake didn't raise his voice, and that's what made them listen. Out here, consistency is power. Margaret tried to be invisible at first. Then she realized invisibility doesn't exist on a ranch. You're either useful or you're a burden. That's the whole scale. The moment that really tested her pride came with a stew pot. She'd filled it too full, because she was still thinking like someone feeding a few guests, not a crew that could eat through a winter larder like locusts. She went to lift it off the stove and the weight stopped her cold, not metaphorically, literally.
The pot didn't move, and for one humiliating second neither did she. A young cowboy named Tom stepped in on instinct, reaching to steady it, and Jake's voice cut across the room, calm but absolute. She doesn't need rescuing, she needs space. Tom froze like he'd been slapped. Margaret's face heated, but she didn't let go. She adjusted her grip, braced her elbows, and moved that pot the way you move something you can't afford to drop. It sloshed, it threatened, but she got it down. Afterwards, her arms shook so badly she had to hide her hands in a towel. That's the thing about Jake Caldwell. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He didn't soften reality for anyone, not for his men and not for the widow who'd come west with her whole life packed in carpetbags. Later that night, after the dishes were stacked and the room went quiet, Jake stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched Margaret scrub a pot black with soot. "You won't last," he said, "if you try to prove something every minute." Margaret didn't look up. "If I don't prove it, I'll be sent away." Jake went quiet for a long beat, like he was choosing words he didn't enjoy using. "I didn't hire you to break you," he said. Margaret finally looked up, suds on her wrists, hair escaping pins. "Then why did you hire me?" Jake's mouth twitched like the truth annoyed him. "For steadiness. This place has had too much noise and not enough steadiness." She didn't understand what he meant yet, not fully. She started to when she saw the wire. Barbed wire wasn't just a tool, it was a statement. Cheap to buy, fast to string, sharp enough to cut flesh and pride the same way. Back east, folks talked about it like progress. Out on the range, it felt like a declaration of war. Jake had begun fencing parts of CC, not every acre, not the kind of endless enclosures that made whole counties boil, but enough to protect his water and hay. Because on the Panhandle, water is life, and life attracts wolves. Sometimes the wolves have forelegs, sometimes they have hands. The first cut came at dawn on an ordinary day, which is exactly how trouble likes to arrive. A rider came in hard, shouting before his horse even stopped in the yard. Jake didn't curse, he didn't argue. His face just went still, like a man hearing a verdict he already expected. Then he saddled up and rode out with several men, dust rolling behind them in a low, bitter cloud. Margaret watched from the cookhouse porch, hands still. She could have stayed where she belonged, tried to go back inside and knead dough, tried to pretend she didn't care. But her eyes kept going to the horizon. When the riders came back that evening, their horses were lathered and their faces were tight. No one spoke much. Anger hung in the air like smoke. At the fence line, the damage had been ugly. Posts leaned, wire lay slack, and the cut ends were clean. That wasn't cattle pressure, that wasn't weather. That was a decision someone made with tools in hand. One cowboy spat and said they knew who did it. Jake answered without heat. Knowing isn't proving. It wasn't cowardice, it was restraint. And restraint is hard out here because it feels like weakness to men who don't understand what a feud costs. That night at supper, the crew ate quiet. Tin spoons clinked, coffee steamed, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like everyone was trying not to say the words that could start something. Jake barely touched his plate. After the men filed out, Margaret found him alone at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold. He stared at nothing, shoulders squared like he was holding the whole ranch in place by force of will. She approached carefully, drying her hands on her apron. "Who did it?" she asked. Jake didn't answer right away. "Then, doesn't matter, not until I can prove it." "And if you can't?" Jake's eyes lifted to hers. "Then it keeps happening." Margaret felt something hard settle in her stomach. "Isn't there law for this?" Jake let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but with no humor in it. "There's law on paper, there's law out here. They don't always shake hands." A few days later, Jake asked Margaret to help with the ranch accounts. He said his penmanship was poor, and it was, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that he trusted her ability to make sense of numbers, and he needed someone steady inside the chaos. So Margaret sat in his small office at night, oil lamp throwing warm light across ledgers and dust. The room surprised her. It wasn't just practical. There were books, not only ranch journals, but literature too. Poetry, a worn Shakespeare. A man like Jake didn't pick those up by accident. It told her he had a past he didn't discuss. As she turned pages in the ledger, she noticed something else. Small gaps, head counts that shifted in ways that didn't sit right. Nothing she could accuse, just enough to make the hair on her arms lift. She closed the book gently, like it might bite. And when Jake walked in and caught her near the desk, Margaret made a choice of her own. She didn't hide by politeness. "I need to know what kind of ranch this is going to be," she said. Jake stared at her a long moment. Then he gave her the truth the way he gave everything. Plain, hard, unromantic. "Same kind it's always been," he said. "One that survives." And Margaret understood in that single word what she was really learning at CC. Not cooking, not bookkeeping, not even how to live under a sky that doesn't care. She was learning what survival demands from people, and how close it can bring you to the edge of the person you promised yourself you'd never become.
2 weeks after Margaret Sullivan arrived at Circle C, the violence finally got close enough to smell. Not the dramatic kind folks brag about in saloons. I'm talking about fresh blood on wool, and that quiet panic that makes grown men forget their jokes. It happened in the middle of an ordinary workday, the kind where the wind never stops, and the sky looks like it's been scrubbed clean. A rider came in from the north pasture with his horse blowing hard, eyes wide, one arm clamped tight to his chest. His name was Eli, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, old enough to think he couldn't be broken. When he swung down from the saddle, his sleeve was dark and wet, and the color wasn't mud. 2 cowboys half carried him toward the cookhouse, talking too fast, all of them trying to make the story sound smaller than it was. Nail got him. No wire. Horse went down. Margaret didn't stand there asking questions. She didn't gasp. She didn't faint.
She moved the way people move when they've already learned what hesitation costs. She cleared the table, boiled water, grabbed clean cloth, and told 2 men to hold Eli still. That cookhouse table had seen bread dough and coffee cups and tired hands. In 1 minute, it became a makeshift clinic. When Margaret cut Eli's sleeve away, the injury told the truth. Barbed wire, a long, jagged slice along the forearm where the metal had grabbed him and refused to let go. Eli tried to be tough. He failed quietly, tears leaking out of the corners of his eyes while he clenched his jaw like it was the only control he had left. Margaret cleaned the wound with whiskey, frontier antiseptic. Not elegant, but it works if you've got nothing else. Then she stitched, fast and careful, using thread and needle meant for mending flour sacks. The motions were precise, no flourish, just competence. Jake Caldwell came in partway through, silent as a shadow. He didn't bark orders, he didn't crowd her. He just watched, eyes steady, reading the room the way he read the weather. When Eli flinched hard from pain, Jake's hand settled on the boy's shoulder. Not gentle, exactly, more like an anchor, a reminder to stay still, because stillness was survival. Margaret tied off the final knot and wrapped the bandage tight. "Keep it clean," she told Eli. "If it gets hot or red, you tell me, immediately." Eli swallowed, pale and sweating. "Yes, ma'am." The cowboys carried him out to the bunkhouse, quieter than they'd come in. When the door shut, the cookhouse felt too still. Steam rose from the kettle. The stove popped once, like it was clearing its throat. Jake looked at Margaret and then at the blood on the cloth. "That wire ding just cut him," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't accusing, he was factual. It changed the ranch. Jake's jaw tightened. The wire didn't change anything. People did. Now think about that for a second. It's the kind of truth that sounds simple until you live inside it. A fence is just metal until someone decides it's an insult. A boundary is just a line until it becomes a reason. Margaret rinsed her hands in a basin, watching the water turn pink, then clear again. "And what will you do," she asked, "when people come to cut more than fences?" Jake's eyes held hers. "What I have to." A clean answer. A dangerous one. The kind that keeps a ranch alive and turns a man into something harder than he wants to be. A few days later, Margaret went into town with Tom Bradley for supplies. Jake didn't order her to stay back. He didn't exactly encourage her either. He just let it happen, which is its own kind of permission. Town looked calm in the daylight. That's how it fools you. A dusty street, weathered storefronts, horses shifting at the rail, a dog sleeping in the shade like it had never heard a gunshot in its life. But the calm was thin. Inside the general store, men spoke low near the stove. The sheriff stood with his hat in his hands, eyes tired, like he'd spent the night arguing with fools and the morning arguing with himself. Someone mentioned fence cutting. Someone else muttered about teaching a lesson. Margaret kept her face neutral and bought flour, lamp oil, and salt. She pretended not to hear because on the frontier, overhearing is easy. Living with what you heard is the hard part. Outside at the water trough, she saw the boy. Not Eli, another one. A homesteader's son. She had noticed him once before in town, trading eggs for flour, shoulders hunched as if the whole world was a cold room. Today he stood with a bucket, hands raw, eyes darting. He looked at the street like it might bite him. When his gaze met Margaret's, he looked away fast. Not guilt exactly, more like expectation. Like he was used to being judged before he spoke. Tom leaned in beside her as she climbed into the wagon. "That one," he said quietly, "lives on a claim near the creek. Folks say his pa's been cutting wire at night." Margaret kept her voice calm. "Do folks know it's true?" Tom gave a small shrug. "Out here, folks don't know much for sure. They just know what they're mad about." That line stuck with her all the way back to Circle C. The wagon wheels creaked, dust rose, the prairie rolled out on both sides like nothing human mattered. Back at the ranch, the men worked with their usual rhythm, but something had shifted under the surface. Margaret felt it in the way conversation stopped when Jake entered, in the way rifles got checked a little more often, in the way Jake's eyes kept drifting toward the fence lines at dusk. Barbed wire was supposed to simplify life. That was the promise. Cheap fence, quick boundary, problem solved. But out here, it didn't solve problems. It concentrated them. That evening after supper, Margaret stepped outside for air. The sky was bruised purple. Wind moved through the grass like a low whisper. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, lonely, not romantic, the sound of a creature doing what it had to do. She returned to her room and tried to sleep. Instead, she dreamed. Not in a poetic way, in a brutal one. She dreamed of wire stretching across the prairie like a spider web, catching everything that touched it. Cattle tangled and bannocked, men snagged and bleeding, families on both sides pulling at the same line until it tore someone open. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and her throat dry. That's the thing about the West. It doesn't only test your hands and your back, it tests your mind. It tests what you believe about fairness and whether you can keep believing it when the land gets tight. Later that morning, Margaret found Jake in his office. He was standing at the window looking out at the corrals like he was watching for a storm only he could see. Letters sat on the desk, neat stacks, ink and paper trying to tame a world that wouldn't be tamed. Margaret didn't accuse him of anything, not then, she wasn't foolish. But she did ask, quietly, "Do you think this ends with talk?" Jake didn't turn right away. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were as steady as ever, and that steadiness carried a kind of warning. "It ends," he said, "when one side decides it can't afford to lose." Margaret held his gaze, feeling the truth of it settle in her bones. Because the wire wasn't just dividing land, it was dividing hunger from hunger, fear from fear. And once that division starts, it doesn't stop just because one person wants peace. She left the office and went back to the cookhouse, to the stove, to the work that always needed doing. Bread still had to rise, coffee still had to be strong, men still had to eat. But the ranch felt different now, like a place that had been sleeping with one eye open and was finally waking up. I'm the host of Savage West Stories, and I'll tell you this plain. Out here, the first blood doesn't always come from a bullet.
Sometimes it comes from a thin, twisted strand of wire, and what that wire makes people willing to do.
Monday always feels harmless on a ranch. That's the trick. The day starts the same as any other. Cold light, wind that never quite stops, coffee that tastes like it was brewed to wake the dead. And then, without warning, the whole place tightens like a rope. Margaret was inside the cookhouse trying to pretend the stove was her only enemy when she heard a sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats, fast. Not the lazy rhythm of a man riding in for breakfast. This was urgent, sharp, the kind of riding that means someone's bringing trouble straight to your door. She stepped to the doorway with flowers still on her hands. A cowboy hit the yard hard, reins hauling his horse down in a spray of dust. He didn't even bother catching his breath before he shouted the words that can sour a whole season. "Wires down on the south line." Jake Caldwell was outside a breath later, moving like he'd been waiting for that sentence. He didn't curse, didn't ask for details. His face just went still, the way a man's face goes when he's trying not to show you what he's thinking. On the frontier, a calm man in a crisis is either strong or dangerous, sometimes both. He headed for the corral. Men snapped into motion around him. Saddles came off rails, cinches were pulled tight, horses danced and snorted as if they could feel it too. This wasn't just about a fence, it was about what the fence meant. Margaret watched from the cookhouse porch, fingers twisting at her apron without realizing it. She'd learned a lot since arriving at Circle C. Learned how to bake bread that didn't turn into a brick, learned how to keep mice out of flour, learned how to scrub iron until her shoulders screamed. But she was still learning the deeper rules. Out here, water and grass are a kind of currency, and wire is a kind of threat. Jake swung into the saddle and rode out with a handful of men, dust trailing behind them in low, bitter plumes. The ranch yard emptied fast, leaving only wind and the creak of the windmill. Margaret went back inside and tried to work. She pressed her hands into dough, but her mind stayed out there on the open prairie with the riders. That's the cruel part about waiting. You can't do anything but imagine, and imagination, when it has nothing else to do, turns mean. By midday, the sun was hard and bright, and the air shimmered over the grass. That kind of light makes everything look clean even when it isn't. The riders were gone a long time. When they finally returned late in the afternoon, Margaret knew the answer before a word was spoken. Horses were lathered, men's faces were set. The kind of silence they carried was heavier than shouting. Jake dismounted without looking at anyone. He handed off his reins like it was a mechanical act, something his body did while his mind stayed somewhere else. Margaret met him near the cookhouse door. "What happened?" she asked. Jake didn't answer right away, but his jaw worked, tight and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "Cut clean." That was all he had to say. Clean cuts meant tools. It meant intention. It meant somebody made a decision in the night and carried it out with their hands. At supper, the long table felt smaller than usual. Tin cups clinked, spoons scraped. Men ate like they were trying not to taste anything. The jokes were gone, the easy noise was gone. You could feel a question hanging over the room like smoke. Who did it? And then the next question, worse than the first. What are we going to do about it? Jake barely touched his plate. He sat with his shoulders squared and his gaze drifting to the window, as if he could see the fence line through the dark glass. When the men finally pushed back their chairs and filed out, boots thudding on the plank floor, Jake stayed at the table. A cup of coffee sat in front of him, gone cold and untouched. Margaret cleaned up in silence for a while, stacking dishes, wiping the table, and she made herself step closer, because she'd lived a life back east where people avoided hard conversations until it was too late. She wasn't going to do that here. "Who do you think did it?" she asked quietly. Jake's eyes didn't leave the window. "Doesn't matter, not until I can prove it." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "And if you can't?" Jake finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, but there was a hard edge under the fatigue. "Then it keeps happening." Now think about that for a second. Not just the fence, the pattern. A small attack that repeats until it becomes normal, until one night somebody gets fed up and decides to answer wire with bullets. Margaret tried another angle, choosing her words like you choose your footing on a steep slope. "Why fence at all if it brings this?" she asked. Jake's mouth tightened into something close to a humorless smile. "Because water's life, and life brings wolves." He wasn't talking like a poet. He was talking like a man who'd seen what happens when you don't protect what keeps your people and animals alive. That night, Margaret lay awake in her small room off the cookhouse, listening to the ranch settle. The wind rubbed at the boards. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted in its stall. The world didn't feel peaceful. It felt like it was holding its breath. A few days later, Jake asked her to help with the ranch accounts. He framed it as practical, said his penmanship was poor, said he needed someone who could keep the books neat. But Margaret understood something about men like Jake. They don't ask for help unless they're already carrying too much. So she went into his office after supper, oil lamp burning low, and she sat at the heavy desk with the ledgers open. The room was all function at first glance. Papers, ink, worn wood, the smell of leather and dust. But then she saw the books on the shelf. Not just ranch journals, not just cattle notes, literature, poetry, a worn volume of Shakespeare with a broken spine. It was a quiet kind of revelation. Jake Caldwell wasn't an ordinary rancher who'd grown up only reading brands and weather. He had education. Not polished manners maybe, but the mind behind him. A man with books like that usually has a past he doesn't want discussed. Margaret ran her finger down the ledger lines and tried to focus on numbers, on tallies, on what came in and what went out. And that's when she noticed something. Not something dramatic, not a clear theft or a glaring lie, just small inconsistencies, missing calves or head counts that shifted in ways that didn't quite match the season. A gap here, a strange note there, enough to make her pause, enough to make her wonder. She closed the book gently, as if the paper could cut her. And in that moment, Jake walked in. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her by lamplight like he was seeing her in a new way, not as the cook, not as the widow, as someone who might actually challenge him. "You need something?" he asked. Margaret stood up slowly. She didn't want to accuse, not without proof, but she couldn't stay silent either. Silence had ruined her once already. "I need to know what kind of ranch this is going to be," she said quietly. Jake didn't move. The lamp flame wavered, throwing shadows across his face. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought he might get angry. Instead, he gave her the truth the way he gave everything. Plain, hard, unromantic. Same kind it's always been. One that survives. Survives. It wasn't a promise of goodness. It wasn't a claim of innocence. It was a statement of priority. Margaret held his gaze, and she understood something the West teaches faster than any city ever could. Survival is a noble word, right up until it becomes an excuse. She didn't argue, she didn't plead, she just nodded once, because she was learning too, learning when to push and when to store a truth away for later. Jake watched her a moment longer, then turned slightly towards the window, looking out at his corrals and fence lines like they were a map of choices. Outside, the wind kept moving over the prairie, indifferent as ever, and somewhere out there, beyond the ranch lights, somebody was still holding cutters in their hands and deciding what kind of world they wanted this to become. Margaret left the office quietly. Back in the cookhouse, the stove ticked as it cooled, and the room smelled of bread and smoke and work that never really ends. But her mind stayed on that single word, survive. Because now she had to ask herself the question she'd been avoiding since she arrived. How much survival could she live with before it started costing her the person she was trying to rebuild?
That night, the ranch didn't feel asleep. It felt like it was pretending. The wind kept combing through the prairie grass, steady and patient, the way it always does out on the Panhandle. The buildings sat dark and low against the sky, and somewhere beyond the corrals, barbed wire stretched across the land like a sentence that hadn't been finished yet. I was barely into sleep when I heard it. Not a shout, not hooves, a thin metallic scrape, the kind of sound you only notice if you've learned what doesn't belong. I sat up in the dark and listened. Then I heard it again, a faint vibration, like the fence itself had drawn a breath. So I did what people do when they're scared but stubborn. I moved. Boots on, match struck, lantern lit. The flame caught and steadied, warm light blooming inside the glass while the rest of the world stayed cold and blue-black. I opened the door and the night hit me in the face, sharp as a slap. And there, out near the fence line, I saw movement. A figure crouched low by a post, close enough to the wire that he was basically breathing on it. A flash of metal in his hands. Cutters. Now, here's the part you need to understand. Out there, a fence isn't just a fence. It's water. It's grass. It's whether your cattle live through the summer. It's whether your men get paid. It's whether a ranch keeps its name or becomes somebody else's property on paper.
So when someone comes with cutters in the night, it doesn't feel like mischief. It feels like someone reaching into your chest. I raised the lantern higher, and the light spilled across the wire in a trembling circle. The barbs glinted like small teeth. The man at the fence froze. He wasn't an outlaw, not even close. He was young, a boy, really. White kid in a patched wool coat and a work shirt that had seen too many washings. His hands were scraped raw. His mouth was cracked from wind. His eyes were wide, not with bravado, but with that scared anger you see in people who've been hungry too long. And then I realized I wasn't alone out there. Jake Caldwell stood a few paces back in the shadow of the post, hat brim low, rifle in his hands. He hadn't called out. He hadn't rushed. He was just there, already waiting, like he'd been expecting the night to test him. Jake held that rifle the way he held everything. Not dramatic, not shaken, not trying to prove a point, just steady. The kind of steadiness that makes your stomach drop, because it means he's already decided what he's capable of. He spoke like a judge who's heard enough. Drop the cutters. The boy didn't move at first. He stared at Jake, then at the lantern, like he was trying to figure out whether mercy was even on the menu tonight. Then he swallowed and forced the words out. Your fence blocks the creek. Jake's voice didn't soften. My fence keeps my cattle alive. The kid's jaw tightened. He lifted his chin. My sisters are alive too. Now think about that for a second. Two truths, both sharp, both heavy, and a rifle sitting between them like the last argument anyone ever makes out here. I felt Margaret Sullivan step in beside the lantern light, close enough that I could see her face clearly. She was wrapped in a shawl, hair pinned back, eyes steady. She didn't look like she belonged on a fence line at night, but that's the thing about the frontier. It doesn't care what you look like. It only cares what you do. Margaret didn't shout at Jake. She didn't plead like a frightened child. She just said his name once, quiet and firm. Jake, don't. Jake didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the boy, and I could almost see the calculation working behind his stare. Not cruelty, not heroics, just that brutal frontier arithmetic. If he let the boy cut the fence, he'd invite more cutting, more losses, more men getting desperate. If he shot the boy, he'd light a fuse that could burn through the whole county. Jake spoke again, low and controlled. Last warning. The boy's fingers loosened. The cutters slipped and fell into the dust with a soft clink. He raised his hands, palms out. That wasn't an apology. That was survival taking over. Jake kept the rifle on him for a long breath, long enough that the air felt thick. Then, inch by inch, he lowered the barrel toward the dirt. Not forgiveness, not trust, just restraint. Go, Jake said. The boy hesitated, like he couldn't believe he was still standing. Margaret took one careful step forward, lantern light brightening her face. Go home. That did it. The boy backed away too fast, and his coat snagged on a barb. He cursed under his breath, more panic than profanity, and jerked harder, fabric pulling tight against the wire. Margaret reached out without thinking, and freed him with precise fingers, careful not to cut herself. In that small motion, you could see exactly who she was becoming out here. Not soft, not reckless, just steady when steadiness mattered. The boy tore free and ran. He stumbled once, caught himself, and kept running into the dark until the prairie swallowed him whole. Jake stood by the post with the rifle lowered, chest rising slow. He didn't relax. Men like him don't relax. They just decide where to put their tension so it doesn't spill on the wrong thing. Margaret exhaled, and the lantern dipped slightly, just a fraction, like her body was finally admitting how close the moment had come to turning ugly. Jake turned toward him then, and his voice had that same hard edge it always did when he was trying to protect himself from feeling too much. You didn't have to come out here. Margaret didn't step back. I live here. That makes it my business. Jake stared at her, and for a heartbeat I saw something behind his eyes. Conflict, surprise, maybe even relief that someone had forced him to stop before he crossed a line. Then he looked out toward the darkness again, toward the direction the boy had fled. Tomorrow, Jake said, I'm riding over there. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. To threaten him? Jake's mouth tightened. To talk. He paused, just long enough for the wind to fill the silence. And if talking fails? He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I'm the host of Savage West Stories, and I'll tell you this straight. The things a person won't say out loud are often the truest parts of them, especially when they're standing under a big sky with a gun in hand. The wire gave a faint hum as the wind shifted, and it sounded almost like the land itself was holding its breath. We walked back toward the ranch lights, lantern glow bobbing over hard ground. The cookhouse windows looked warm from a distance, but up close you could see how thin the walls really were, how fragile the idea of safety is out here. Margaret set the lantern on the table, flame steadying, the room filled with familiar smells. Smoke, iron, old wood. Comfort, if you were willing to call it that. Jake paused in the doorway, half in shadow, and looked back once toward the fence line like he expected the night to speak again.
Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't scold him, didn't praise him either. Out here, words can be sparks, and both of them knew the prairie was dry. Jake stepped inside and shut the door. And you might think that was the end of it. The boy ran. Jake didn't shoot. Everyone goes back to bed. But the frontier doesn't work that way. It doesn't end when the danger passes. It starts when you realize danger can come back, and next time it might come with friends. Next time it might come with guns. Next time, restraint might not be enough. So hold on to that image. Wire singing, lantern light trembling, a rifle lowering by inches, because tomorrow brings daylight, and daylight brings choices you can't hide from. And once a man like Jake Caldwell decides he's riding to talk, the whole county can feel it, even if nobody says a word.
Jake rode out the next morning with 2 men, and he did it the way he did most things. Quiet, efficient. Like if he kept it calm on the outside, maybe it would stay calm everywhere else. He told Margaret to stay on the ranch. Not harshly, not like a threat, just a plain instruction from a man who learned that one extra witness can turn a conversation into a tragedy. Margaret watched him from the cookhouse doorway as he tightened his cinch and checked his rifle. The sky was that pale, washed-out Texas morning color, and the wind had teeth in it, the kind of wind that dries your thoughts until all you've got left is whatever you really mean. Jake swung into the saddle and looked back once, not quite meeting her eyes. "Don't follow," he said. Then he rode out. Now, if you've been listening to me at Savage West Stories for any length of time, you already know what comes next. A woman like Margaret didn't cross half a continent just to be told what to do by a man she'd known a few weeks. She'd swallowed pride back east until it nearly choked her. She wasn't interested in doing it again out here. So she waited long enough for the dust to settle. Then she saddled the calmest horse on the place and followed at a distance, keeping low behind the rise lines, staying far enough back that if things went wrong, she wouldn't be the spark. That ride taught her something the cookhouse never could. The prairie looks empty until you're the only one on it. Then it feels like an ocean with no shore. Sound carries, wind carries, and your thoughts, those come along whether you invite 'em or not. She kept seeing the boy's face from the night before. Not an outlaw, not a villain, just hungry and angry enough to do something stupid. And she kept seeing Jake's face, too. That quiet, steady look, the kind that can hold a promise or hold a bullet. The homestead came into view as a low bruise on the land. Not a real house with painted boards and a porch swing, a sod structure, half dug into the earth like it was trying to hide. A lean-to attached on one side, a small corral made from scavenged timber, smoke coming from a crude chimney in a thin line, like even the fire didn't want to waste heat. Margaret slowed her horse and stayed behind a rise. From there she could see enough. Too much, really. A woman stood in the doorway holding a baby. White dress faded to the color of dust, hair pulled back tight, eyes fixed on the riders like she'd been taught by life to expect the worst from any stranger with a saddle. The father came out with a shotgun. He didn't raise it, but he held it across his chest the way men do when they want you to know they're not helpless. Narrow shoulders, beard patchy, face lined with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working hard for a week. It comes from working hard for years and still being behind. Jake dismounted slowly. That mattered. Fast movements are how you start funerals. He kept his hands visible. He didn't smile, and that mattered too. Smiling in a moment like that could look like mockery. Margaret couldn't hear every word from where she watched, but she didn't need all of them. She'd lived long enough among men to recognize the shape of the fight, even when it stays civil. Jake spoke first, calm, controlled. The homesteader answered sharp. The anger came out like it had been fermenting for months. At one point, the father jabbed a finger toward the creek draw, Jake's creek, like he was pointing at an open wound. And then he said something that made Jake's posture shift, just slightly. The smallest tilt of the head, the kind of movement a man makes when he hears a truth he doesn't want to hear. That's when Margaret understood what this really was. It wasn't only about wire, it was about water. Out there, water isn't a convenience. It's the difference between a child living through August or not. It's whether a cow calves healthy. It's whether a ranch survives the year. It's life in the most literal sense, and the Panhandle doesn't hand out life freely. Jake reached into his saddlebag and pulled out folded papers. He held them out like a man offering proof instead of fists. The homesteader took them, glanced down, and his face tightened. Then he laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was bitterness, the sound of someone realizing the other man has something he doesn't. Paperwork. Jake said something short, not a plea, not an apology, more like terms. The woman in the doorway shifted the baby higher on her hip. Her eyes never left Jake. She looked like she was memorizing him in case she needed to curse his name later. Then Jake mounted and turned away. No shots, no shouting, no dramatic showdown. Just a conversation that ended with two men still hungry, still proud, and still trapped in the same harsh geography. Margaret stayed hidden until the riders had a head start. Then she turned her horse and took the long way home, her mind working like a stone grinder. Back at Circle C, Jake returned near dusk. He moved through the yard without looking at anyone. Hank and the other men went to unsaddle. Jake didn't linger. He went straight to the office like the air inside the house might be easier to breathe. Margaret waited. Not in the doorway this time. She gave him a few minutes, then followed. The office was lit by an oil lamp. Books on one wall, ledgers on the desk, a framed landscape painting that looked like a memory Jake didn't talk about. Jake stood by the window, staring out to the corrals like he could see the future between the fence posts. Then, without warning, he grabbed a sheet of paper off the desk and tore it in half. Not a neat tear, not careful, a hard, sudden rip, like he needed to feel something give. Margaret stopped in the doorway. She didn't speak right away. She knew better to step into a man's anger too fast. Anger has its own gravity. Jake finally turned his head slightly. "What happened?" Margaret asked. Jake's voice was rough. "He's got a legal claim to access water if he can prove the creek's public, navigable, shared, however the lawyers decide to say it." Margaret's stomach tightened. "So he can just take it?" Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. "He can try, and if he makes enough noise in town, he might get a judge to listen." Margaret stepped farther in. "Then you'll share water?" Jake looked at her like she'd asked him to cut his own throat. "You ever try sharing a bucket in a drought? It starts with one family, then another, then 10. Then I'm feeding the county while my cattle die." Margaret didn't flinch, but she didn't soften either. She said, quiet and steady, "If you ride over there angry, someone's wife ends up a widow." Jake stared at her, chest rising and falling slow, like he was forcing himself back under control. Then Margaret did something dangerous. She told him the truth that had been chewing at her since she stepped between his rifle and that boy. "Jake," she said, "if you kill or ruin people because it's easier than figuring out a harder way, you'll be right, maybe, and you'll be alone." Jake's face tightened. "What gives you the right to say that?" he asked. Margaret's voice stayed level. "Because I know what it looks like when a decent man becomes a monster one necessary choice at a time." The lamp flame wavered. The room felt smaller. Jake's eyes locked on her, and for a moment, Margaret saw it, how badly he wanted permission to be cruel. Not because he enjoyed cruelty, because cruelty is simple. It's clean in a brutal way. It ends conversations. Restraint don't end anything. Restraint just postpones the next problem. Jake finally spoke low and tight. "Don't do that again." Margaret held his gaze. "Give me fewer reasons." Silence stretched between them like wire pulled taut. Jake turned back to the window, jaw working, and Margaret saw what he wouldn't say out loud. He didn't know how to solve this without becoming the kind of man he hated. And that's the trouble with the frontier. People think the West was lawless. It wasn't. It was full of laws. Paper laws in county books, and older laws written in hunger, winter, and pride. Sometimes those laws collide right over a creek. Margaret left the office without another word. She walked back into the cookhouse where the stove still radiated heat, where the smell of bread could almost pretend the world made sense. Almost. Outside, the wind kept moving over the prairie, indifferent as ever. Somewhere out there, a homesteader's children were waiting for water. Somewhere else, Jake's cattle needed that same water to keep the ranch alive. And in the middle stood a fence made of twisted steel, humming softly, like it was asking the question nobody wanted to answer. Who gets to live when there isn't enough to go around?
When the snow finally loosened its grip, Circle C did what ranches always do after a hard season. It counted what was left. Fences needed mending, scattered cattle had to be gathered, the barn roof had to be patched before the next storm decided to finish the job. Work came back in waves, and nobody had the luxury of sitting down to feel sorry for themselves for very long. But something had changed after that winter. The yard looked the same at first glance, rough buildings, corrals, the windmill complaining in the wind, but the people moved differently, slower, leaner, like the cold had carved away anything unnecessary. Jake Caldwell was harder to read than ever. In the days after the storm and after Will Morrison's brush with death, he was present, close, involved. And then, once the danger passed, he pulled back into that old habit of distance like it was armor. At meals, he ate fast, spoke only when the subject was ranch business, left the table as soon as he was finished, like staying longer might invite something he didn't know how to handle. Margaret noticed. Of course she did. She wasn't the sort of woman who missed small shifts. Back east, she'd survived by noticing them. A slight change in tone, a pause before a lie, a silence that said more than a speech. Now, at Circle C, she felt Jake's eyes on her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. Not in a crude way, in a searching way, like he was weighing something and didn't like the answer. It was Tom Bradley who finally said what the whole ranch seemed to be thinking. He was in the cookhouse one afternoon, sitting at the table while Margaret peeled potatoes. Tom's arm had healed from its break, but he still found excuses to be around. Some folks call that laziness. I call it loneliness, looking for company. He watched Margaret work for a minute, then grinned. "You two are dancing around each other worse than green coats," he said. Margaret didn't look up. "I don't know what you mean." Tom snorted softly. "Sure you don't." Margaret's cheeks warmed, but she kept her knife moving. That was her trick. Keep your hands busy so your face doesn't betray you. Tom leaned back in his chair, still smiling. Jake doesn't spend half his time staring at the cookhouse window when he thinks no one's watching. Before Margaret could find a sharp reply, the sound of hooves cut across the yard. Fast, heavy, wrong. Two riders came in hard. Not the steady pace of men returning from routine work. These horses were being pushed. Dust and damp clods flew from their hooves. The riders' bodies leaned forward in the saddle like they were trying to outrun the bad news following behind. Margaret looked out the window and her stomach turned cold. Jake and Hank were riding in, and across Hank's saddle something was slung in blankets. Jake didn't even wait to dismount before he shouted, "Get water boiling and clean cloths." And Margaret had heard that tone before. Not from Jake, but from the kind of men who bring injuries in and expect the world to stop. She snapped into motion. Pots off the stove, clean cloth laid out, extra lamps lit, no hesitation, no discussion. The cookhouse became what it had become before, part kitchen, part field hospital. They carried in Will Morrison, the storekeeper's nephew, 16 years old maybe, new to ranch work, still in that stage where courage and foolishness can look the same from a distance. His face was white as paper, his breathing was shallow and quick, blood soaked the blanket around his middle. "Gored by a bull," Jake said, short and tight. "It's bad." Margaret peeled back the blanket carefully, and the wound told the story without any need for drama. Deep, ragged, still bleeding. The kind of injury that didn't care how brave you were. Out in Philadelphia, a doctor would have instruments, chloroform, a clean room, maybe another physician to consult. Out here, Margaret had a kitchen table, boiled water, whiskey, and whatever steady hands she could bring to bear. Her voice stayed calm, because calm is contagious. She said, "I need more light, all the lamps. Tom, get my sewing basket, the one with the silk thread. Hank, I need the good whiskey." Jake's eyes flicked to her face. He said quietly, "Margaret, if it's too much—" "It's not too much," she cut in, and there was steel in it. "But I need everyone to do exactly as I say." You could feel the room shift. Cowboys who might argue about anything else didn't argue now. Hats came off, men moved quickly and quietly. the cookhouse filled with the smell of smoke and blood and fear. Margaret cleaned the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth. She stitched what she could, hands steady, jaw set. She boiled the silk thread like it was surgical equipment. She packed the injury with clean cloth soaked in honey, an old remedy, not magic, but sometimes the old methods were all you had. Jake stayed at Will's head, holding him still, speaking in a low voice whenever the boy stirred towards consciousness. "You're doing fine," Jake murmured. "Mrs. Sullivan's got the best hands in Texas. You'll be dancing at the Christmas social." Margaret didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. Every second mattered. 2 hours passed in a blur of lamplight and tight breathing and careful knots. When she finally tied off the last stitch, she stepped back, shoulders trembling with exhaustion. Will's breathing was stronger, his color was a shade less gray, but Margaret knew the danger wasn't over. Infection could still take him. Fever could still turn those stitches into a cruel joke. "He needs to stay absolutely still," she told Jake. "A week at least. Someone has to watch. If fever sets in, we take shifts." Jake didn't hesitate. "We'll take shifts, whatever he needs." They moved Will to Margaret's own bed because it was closest to the cookhouse warmth and easiest to monitor. Jake protested with his eyes, but Margaret didn't give him room to argue. "I can sleep on the settle," she said. "He needs the bed more than I do." That night, Margaret sat beside Will's bed with a lamp turned low. Jake stayed too. He didn't leave, not once. And in the quiet, with Will's breathing the only steady sound, Jake spoke in a voice that surprised Margaret. "You were remarkable today," he said. Margaret's laugh came out thin. "I was terrified." She checked Will's forehead again. Still cool, for now. "In Philadelphia," she admitted, "I only assisted. My husband made the decisions. He carried the weight. Today it was mine." Jake stared at the floor a moment, then paused and added softly, "After my wife died, I swore I'd never be responsible for another person's life that way." He paused, then added softly, "Then you arrived." Margaret's throat tightened. She kept her eyes on Will because looking at Jake felt dangerous. Jake shifted in his chair, then leaned forward, elbows on knees like he was bracing himself. "That first day," he said, "I told myself you were just an employee. Keep it business, keep it distant, safe. But then you burned those biscuits and swore like a sailor." Margaret's mouth twitched despite herself. "And you set Tom's arm without flinching, and you turned my cookhouse into something alive again. It's not just cooking, it's hope." He looked up at her then, gray eyes raw in the lamplight. "It's caring whether men have pie after supper, whether there's light in the windows, whether someone bleeds alone." Will stirred, murmured something, then settled again. Margaret swallowed. "You should rest," she whispered. Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a worn book. Poetry, of all things. "I'll read," he said. "Sarah said it helps when someone was sick." And there, in that small frontier room, with wind tapping the boards and a boy fighting for his life, Jake Caldwell read poetry in a low, steady voice. Not to impress anyone, not for show, just because it was the only kind of comfort he knew how to give. The fever came on the second night. Will's skin burned under Margaret's hand. His breathing sped up. His eyes rolled back with pain and confusion. Margaret bathed him with cool water, forced small sips of willow bark tea between his lips, and prayed harder than she'd prayed in years. Jake didn't leave her side. He fetched water, he changed cloths, he held the lamp. He stayed present when Margaret's hands began to tremble from exhaustion. Near dawn, the fever finally broke. Will's breathing slowed, sweat cooled on his forehead, his face relaxed like a fist unclenching. Margaret sagged back in her chair, suddenly aware of every ache in her body. A little later, Will opened his eyes, clearer now, and whispered, "Ma'am, did I miss breakfast?" Margaret laughed and the sound cracked something open in her chest. "Several," she said, voice rough with relief, "but when you're stronger, I'll make you the finest breakfast in Texas." Jake took her outside onto the porch for air. The night had drained away and the morning was cool and clean. Margaret swayed with exhaustion and Jake steadied her without thinking, hands firm at her arms. For one quiet moment, she leaned against Jake. Solid warmth, the kind you don't realize you've been missing until it's there. "You did it," Jake murmured into her hair. "We did it," Margaret corrected softly. Jake's mouth curved in a tired, honest smile. "We make a good team." The words hung there, full of possibility. Jake drew back just enough to look at her. "When this is over," he said, "when Will's recovered, we need to talk, really talk, about the future." Margaret's breath caught, but before she could answer, Tom called from inside that Will wanted more tea.
The moment shattered. Margaret stepped back, smoothed her apron like it could smooth her heart too, and went back inside to her patient. But the truth stayed with her. Jake Caldwell, the quiet, weathered rancher who'd built walls around his grief, had let her see something underneath, something tender, something afraid. And on the frontier, that might be the most dangerous thing of all.
Spring came in the Panhandle the way it usually does. Not with a parade, not with a promise. It just shows up one morning and you realize the wind doesn't cut quite as deep, and the dirt, same dirt that tried to kill everything a few months ago, has decided to let green push through again. Out at Circle C, the land looked patched together. Muddy ruts where snowdrifts had been, fence posts that leaned a little more than they used to, a herd that was smaller and meaner tempered, like it remembered the winter better than the men did. Jake Caldwell moved through those days like a man counting losses without saying the numbers out loud. He worked the corrals, checked latches, walked past the cookhouse, and kept his eyes forward like looking too long might cost him something. Margaret saw all of it. She didn't comment on it, not at first. Because here's the truth. The frontier teaches faster than any schoolhouse ever could. People heal in the places they're allowed to, and Jake wasn't the kind of man who healed in public. Then one afternoon, the past came riding up the ranch road in a patched wool coat. The homesteader boy, the fence cutter. He didn't ride in like an outlaw. No gun show, no swagger, just a thin kid with his hat in his hands, shoulders tight, eyes down. The kind of posture you get when you've spent too many nights listening to adults argue about whether your family deserves water. Margaret saw him from the cookhouse doorway. Her first instinct was anger, because she remembered the wire humming in the dark, remembered Jake's rifle, and the way the air had gone still. But the second instinct was something else, something colder and more practical. If that boy came here in daylight, he didn't come to fight. Jake stepped into the yard and stopped a few paces away, like he was setting distance the way he set boundaries. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even move much. The boy spoke. You could see it cost him. His father, he said, would stop cutting wire if Jake let them draw water from the creek twice a week. Specific days, specific place. No crossing fences, no grazing cattle where they weren't supposed to. Just water. Jake listened without blinking. And if you've never watched a man swallow pride for the sake of peace, let me tell you, it doesn't look noble. It looks like pain. Jake finally answered with the same tone he used for everything that mattered. Twice a week, he said, and you don't touch my wire again. The boy nodded like he'd been holding his breath since last winter. Then he backed away, mounted up, and rode off without looking back. No handshake, no gratitude, no clean ending. Just an agreement held together by necessity. Margaret watched Jake's face after the dust settled. He looked like he'd accepted a bitter medicine. Not because he wanted to be kind, but because he understood the alternative. That's one of the quiet tragedies of the West. Folks talk like violence is a choice people make because they're wicked. Sometimes it's a choice people make because they run out of better options. The hard part is refusing to run out. That night, Jake stood with Margaret outside the cookhouse. The sky was wide and clear, stars cutting through the dark like cold nails. The fence line stretched across the land, still there, still humming faintly in the wind. Jake said, almost to himself, "The open range is dying. I can feel it." Margaret didn't argue. She'd seen enough to know he wasn't being dramatic. With every new coil of wire, with every deed filed in a county office, the old way of drifting cattle across endless grass was shrinking into something fenced and counted. She said, maybe, but something else is being born. Jake glanced at her. You mean fences and paperwork? Margaret let out a quiet laugh. No, I mean a life that isn't just running from grief. That landed harder than she expected. Jake went still, the way he always did when a truth got too close. He looked out at the darkness beyond the fence as if it might answer him. Then he said it, not cleanly, not with romance, with the awkward bluntness of a man who'd spent years talking to cattle in silence instead of people. Margaret, I can offer you wages, a place, security. Margaret turned toward him. She could smell the cookhouse smoke on his clothes, the clean night air behind it. She could see how tired he was of holding the world together alone. She said quietly, I didn't come west for security. Jake frowned like he didn't understand. Margaret continued, I came west because I needed a chance to become someone I could stand to live with. Jake studied her face, and in that moment his gray eyes didn't look hard. They looked unsure, like he'd built a life around not needing anything, and suddenly he couldn't pretend anymore. And now, he asked? Margaret swallowed. Now I want something more dangerous than security. Jake's voice went low. What's that? A partnership, Margaret said. The kind where you tell the truth even when it makes you look smaller. Jake exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Then I'll tell you the truth. He took her hand, slow, careful. Not claiming her, not testing her, asking. I don't know how to be happy without waiting for it to be taken. Now think about that for a second. That's not a cowboy line. That's not bravado. That's a man admitting he's been living like the world is always one storm away from stealing everything again. Margaret squeezed his hand once firm. Then don't wait. Build.
Jake nodded, and when he spoke again, his voice had the weight of a decision he'd avoided for years. Stay here, he said, not as hired help, as my family. Margaret didn't answer fast. Only fools answer fast when the stakes are this high. She looked at the ranch, the rough buildings, the windmill creaking like a tired old witness, the cookhouse she turned into something livable, the men who'd come to rely on her steadiness, her food, her calm hands when blood showed up. Then she looked at Jake Caldwell, a man capable of cruelty, yes, a man capable of restraint, too. A man who'd lowered a rifle by inches in the dark and then chosen the harder road in daylight. Yes, she said, but we do it my way, too. Jake's mouth tilted slightly, almost amused. Your way includes telling me when I'm being a fool. Margaret's voice stayed dry, constantly. Jake let out a quiet laugh that sounded like it had rust on it, but it was real. And I'll tell you, that laugh mattered more than any fancy proposal ever could, because it meant something in him had shifted, not healed, people don't heal clean out here, but loosened, like a knot finally giving just enough to let blood flow again. Life didn't turn gentle overnight, it never does. They still fight about money sometimes, about the men, about whether mercy invites more trouble, about whether wire was the future or a curse. But here's the difference. They didn't reach for guns, they reached for words. And in the West, that's its own kind of courage. A week later, Margaret saw the homesteader boy on the distant road. He paused, stared at the fence line like he hated it and needed it at the same time, then kept going. No cutters, no midnight shadow. Just a kid learning the shape of compromise. The wire stayed, the land stayed hard, the sky stayed big enough to make you feel small whenever it pleased. But Margaret Sullivan and Jake Caldwell stopped living like people who were only trying to survive. They started living like builders. I'm your host from Savage West Stories, and I'm going to leave you with this, because it's the truest thing I can say about the frontier without dressing it up. The West didn't hand out happy endings, it handed out chances. Sometimes if you were stubborn enough and honest enough, you could turn a chance into a home.